Morning. Welcome to Bellingham Unitarian Fellowship. I'm Reverend Paul Beckel. This month I celebrate the 25th anniversary of my ordination in May 1996 at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Bloomington, Illinois, where I had just completed my ministerial internship. Just half an hour before the ceremony, while I was running around being gracious and dorky and scatterbrained, as I continue to do on Sunday mornings, our 12-day-old Benjamin so thoroughly pooped through his special new outfit that after changing him, Jane had to throw the whole thing away. Then, with unflappable grace, she handed Ben to my sister and came up front to begin the service by lighting the chalice with these words: "At times, our own light goes out and is rekindled by a spark from another person. May we remember with gratitude those who have lit the flame of hope within us." Today, I cannot express enough gratitude to her and to so many others in the congregations that I have served who have repeatedly rekindled my spirit.
I am a lifelong Unitarian Universalist. It is in my blood. When I graduated from college, I moved to Minneapolis, St. Paul. And it's funny, but it was my grandma who suggested that I find a church when I talked to her about feeling lonely. Good thing I followed her advice, because I did just that. And it was there a year later that a cute blonde Paul Beckel showed up one day. We both were very active in the young adult group there, and that group sustained us through some difficult times. Now our own children are young adults, and one of them is with me today, and the other is with us on Zoom. And I'm so grateful that we had the opportunity to raise them in Unitarian Universalist congregations. I'm really grateful to those churches, those congregations. These years, as Paul and I have journeyed together, I've also been so incredibly grateful for his ministerial colleagues and the way they have supported him, and their partners supported me, and we've been with each other in good and bad times. The Unitarians in my life have I just don't know what I'd do without it. So I light this chalice today in honor of all those who have helped us along the way.
As she lights the chalice, let's say together our covenant. Love is the spirit of this fellowship, and service gives it life. Celebrating our diversity and joined by a quest for truth, we work for peace and honor all creation. This is our covenant. That that simple, gentle song so gracefully weaves the message that using our gifts to build the common good need be no burden, but a source of deep gladness. E.B. White said something similar, but with more angst. Something like, I arise each morning torn between the desire to save the world and to savor it. So whether this theme is expressed with gentleness or angst, it represents the dilemma and the blessing, which is the liberal religious tradition. Life is so good, so hard, so sweet, so unfair, and unfinished. And our gifts, whatever we may discover them to be, how might we use them to engage with this fullness of life's joys and injustices so as to be useful and to be happy, especially in those times of deep loss, which brings me to today's story for all ages. Okay, you can see them on the monitor there. Stop giving me ice cream. I can't stand ice cream, shouted Peter, flinging his bowl across the room. Startled, Peter's parents looked up. Peter wrenched open the door and ran out of the house. Get back here, said his mother. Oh, let him go, said his father. Peter hurried down the sidewalk as if pushed by a mighty and furious wind. Mishka, Mishka, he thought as his feet pounded the pavement. Come back, Mishka, I love you. A tap on his back made him look up. It was his neighbor, Mr. McIntyre. Peter, my friend, you look a million miles away. What's on your mind? My dog's gone. Gone? Where? Lost? Stolen? Just gone, Peter answered. As far as you can go. She's dead, Mr. Mac. Dead. I could wish on my birthday candles and shooting stars, but she's never, ever coming back. Mr. Mac reached down. Peter, come help an old man up onto his porch. I have a rocking chair that's been needing a body in it for some time now. The first step is always the trickiest, so don't go rushing off when I need you. He put his hand on Peter's shoulder, and together they made their way up the stairs. Sit down and rock a bit, said Mr. Mac. Rocking is good for the soul. Peter slowly got a little more comfortable. It's not fair, though, Mr. Mac. Why did Mishka have to die? Sometimes there isn't a single reason in the world for something to happen. The way I figure it, Peter, you can't stop the seasons from changing or the sun from setting on a life. Didn't always think that way, though. When it happened to me, darn near wore me out. There was no talking sense to me then. I was like that today. I threw a bowl of ice cream. But I thought you liked ice cream. Well, I haven't really liked much of anything these days. I think I understand. But, Mr. Mac, she was the most beautiful husky there ever was. Now she's gone. I lost someone beautiful too, Peter. Mr. Mack's eyes narrowed and dimmed, like candles started by a sudden wind. She was my best friend, Peter said. Mr. Mack nodded his head in understanding. A long time ago, when I was a baby, that was, I used to hold her ears and drink my bottle. Mom called Mishka my doggy blanket. Imagine that, Mr. Mack laughed. His laughter tugged Peter's mouth into a small smile. I could take 2 days to tie my shoes and she'd still wait for me. Ah, yes, a patient friend. They're real hard to find. I bet you could look into her eyes and know that she loved you. Hey, Mr. Mack, how did you know that? Oh, I've seen that look, Peter. Goes right down to your heart. It kind of lights you up like a jack-o'-lantern. She got really sick, though. So sick, I had to help her do almost everything. She couldn't even walk. If I was strong enough, I would have carried her. Oh, I did, murmured Mr. Mack. I had to feed her, said Peter. Same as you'd feed a baby, said Mr. Mack, a tear silently slipping down his neck. She couldn't see. Peter closed his eyes. We had to help them find their way, said Mr. Mack, looking off in the distant hills. I put my arms around her. I said, I love you, Mishka. Please don't leave. She felt so warm. I didn't want to let go. Then I kissed her and said goodbye. Goodbyes are something awful, Peter, but at least we got to do that. Not everyone gets a chance to say farewell to a friend. Sometimes I think she's next to me, said Peter, putting his hand out. And I reach for her at night. So do I, whispered Mr. Mack. And then their hands touched gently on the chairs. Where do you think they went? Somewhere very beautiful, Peter, where there isn't any pain. A place where they can see and walk and run. You mean Mishka sees again? She sees every minute of every day. I think you could see her too. How, Mr. Mack? How do I do anything? Tell me. Close your eyes, Peter, as tight as you can. Are you ready? Are you coming with me, Mr. Mack? Yes, Peter, I'm right beside you. Then I'm ready. Now, let's pretend you're going on a wonderful journey beyond the sun, beyond the moon, and beyond the stars. Peter felt himself lifted. He felt the magic and the joy and the wonder of seeing what he had loved and lost return to him. The broken pieces of his heart moved back together as if brushed by wings of angels. I see her, Mr. Mack. I see her. She's running. She's smiling. I could always tell when she was smiling. Oh, I see her too, Peter. They're friends. They're going to take good care of each other. Peter opened his eyes. Mr. Mack, will Mishka remember me? Peter, even if you become a bent old man with white hair and lines on your face, Mishka will know you as her beautiful, kind, brown-eyed boy. So they never forget. They never forget, my friend. Peter stood up and stretched his legs. Mr. Mack, I don't really hate ice cream. Then, Peter, when you come back, we'll have some together. That old chair liked your company. Peter started down the porch steps and suddenly turned around. Mr. Mack, your friend, it was Mrs. McIntyre, right? Yes, Peter. She was the best friend I ever had. And that's the end. For our meditation today, I would like to share some words from the novel Adam Bede by George Eliot. Let's begin by grounding ourselves, letting our body fall into place, not in the slouchy place, but in the firm, straight position where we're in touch with the world, we're feeling strong and alert, and yet restful at the same time. As always, you may find it helpful to close your eyes during our meditation, but today we'll be sharing some words on the screen, so you may wish to look there too. It would be a poor result of all of our anguish and our wrestling if we won nothing but our old selves at the end of it. A poor result of all our anguish and our wrestling if we won nothing but our old selves at the end of it. If we could return to the same blind loves, the same self-confident blame, the same light thoughts of human suffering, self-confident blame there, I think she means smug, blaming somebody else. The same light thoughts of human suffering. The same frivolous gossip over blighted human lives. What a shame if in the end we still have the same feeble sense of that unknown toward which we have sent forth irrepressible cries in our loneliness. No, rather let us be thankful that our sorrow lives in us as an indestructible force, only changing its form as forces do, and passing from pain into sympathy, the one poor word which includes all our best insight and our best love. And in the spirit of knowing that we live in a world of pain and injustice, joy and sorrow, curiosity and memory, let's take a moment to share some of these things. Maybe it'll help us to reflect on where we've come from and whether we're still that same person that we were before this happened. So if you'd like, use the chat box to share something with us, a milestone from your life. And now you might want to close your eyes, because I'll just go ahead and read the chat as they come over, and you can hold one another in spirit. grieving missing loved ones, Joan, Jim, and Joanne. Turning 60 this year. My son turning 25 this year. My old self needed only my acceptance and forgiveness to let me move on. Grateful that my parents are vaccinated and that I'm halfway there. I don't always know why I am crying, but I know that I feel more free afterward. Watching events I have dreaded finally happen and surviving. My daughter going off to college in the fall. New grandson, Baylor. Glad my son is coming home from college next week. That's from someone I didn't know was here, my brother-in-law, Mike, in North Carolina. That's sweet. I'm glad to see you, Mike. Committing to helpful tools for a difficult life issue. And for all of the unspoken concerns and desires and satisfactions and uncertainties, let's continue to hold one another in our hearts and be grateful for this beloved community. And now Daria will share an anti-racism message.
Good morning. For today's A Racism Minute, I'm sharing a recent piece that was written by Dan Rather. Guilty on all charges. A surprise? It shouldn't have been. We all saw the video of a murder taking place before our eyes. The jury, a multiracial assemblage of Derek Chauvin's peers, saw the same thing. And it didn't take long for them to come to that conclusion. The history of how power, race, and the will of the state have played out over the course of our nation's history did mean that this verdict, unanimous and complete, carried some currents of surprise. No facts or video were enough for millions of Americans watching the verdict in real time with pits in stomachs to feel the luxury of taking this outcome for granted. We have been here before, far too many times. We have seen pictures of our past, of lynchings and slave auctions, but also of more recent times to understand the fraught shadows that hung over this trial. And yet we have a guilty verdict, 3 of them on all counts. While this provides justice for George Floyd, what it means as a larger symbol is something that we cannot know at this time. Is it an inflection point or a blip? Is it a further bending of the arc of the universe towards justice, or is it a detour? I have lived long enough as an optimist to cling to that lens through which to view today's news. To be sure, the system often doesn't work, especially for Black Americans and other marginalized communities. But today, the system worked. It worked because of the bravery of the young woman, Darnella Frazier, who shot the unflinching video. It worked because of the peaceful protests in the streets. It worked because the Minneapolis Police Department made it clear that this is not who they want to be. It worked because of the prosecutors and the jury. We cannot wash ourselves of the sins of the past, and we cannot allow ourselves to ignore them. But we also cannot allow ourselves to lose hope and sense of purpose. I recognize it is easy for me, with the privileges I carry, to make such a statement. So I turn for inspiration to the leaders in the past and present who fight on in the hope to align the reality of America to the noblest of our founding ideals. I pray for a continued march of progress, recognizing that each step forward can only be accomplished with great grit, resilience, and determination. Today, America took an important step. It is but one step, and many more remained. It is no assurance that we will continue to stride forward in justice, but it is also a day to pause and reflect that a better, more just, more equitable America, a more perfect union for all our citizens, is indeed possible. We cannot, will not be perfect. We must be better, ever improving. Today's verdict has made the embers of hope glow a little brighter. Dan Rather.
Yeah. Daria's reflections on the Chauvin verdict remind me that my time as a Unitarian Universalist has been framed by the police brutality against Rodney King in the 1990s and the police brutality against George Floyd. Might there be glimmers of hope, of growing awareness across that span of time? And I'm not asking this about society out there. I'm asking myself. And today I invite you to ask yourself, what have you learned over the past 10, 20, 30 years? How have you grown? Is it even possible to retain the spark of hope, the spirit of compassion, the fire of commitment lit in you perhaps long, long ago? I was born in 1964 during Vatican II. The Global Council of Catholic Bishops called to Rome to debate proposals to reform and modernize the church and to rethink their position on being unique in holding the keys to salvation and God's favor. I never heard any of this growing up in rural community in northern Minnesota, but today I am curious. How did it come about that with my conservative Catholic background and graduating from a high school seminary and then becoming an atheist, how did I become a religious liberal and a Unitarian Universalist, no less? Here is part of the final official statement that came out of Vatican II. Since Christ died for everyone, and since all are in fact called to one and the same destiny, which is divine, we must hold that the Holy Spirit offers to all the possibility of being made partners in salvation. It may seem nerdy or even bizarre to go looking for connections between Universalism and Catholicism in the fine print in the Vatican archives, but I see a glimmer of connection there. And I imagine you too may wonder sometimes about your own journey. How did I get from there all the way to here? I made that initial passage from there to close to here over the course of just 4 years, in which I whitewashed barns, had a very short stint in the Marine Corps, led a cross-country team at Creighton University, attended Hunter College in New York City and Emory University in Atlanta, worked in a clinic in the Dominican Republic, got married, graduated with a degree in philosophy from Catholic Universiteit, founded in 1425 in Leuven, Belgium. Life was fascinating, exhilarating. Then over the next 4 years, there were fewer events, but much greater intensity. I fathered my first child, got divorced, lost custody of my son, and found my idealism crushed. At a moment of intense disillusionment, a newspaper ad caught my eye, announcing a meeting of the American Humanist Association to be held at the First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis. I did not know what a humanist was, but it sounded like something I had once heard condemned in a sermon, so couldn't be all bad. I went to the meeting and listened to the group discuss how self-contradictory the Bible is. I agreed with pretty much everything they were talking about, but I also thought that everything they were talking about was irrelevant. I left the meeting disappointed, but curious. Where was I? I picked up a flyer in the lobby that described Unitarian Universalism as a tradition which affirmed the individual religious quest while providing a supportive community. So I went back a few days later to attend a young adult gathering. It was Earth Day, a day of hope and renewal. The young adult group watched slides taken by a guy who had just come back from Eastern Europe, where he'd found himself in the midst of a huge freedom rally and people tearing down the Iron Curtain with both their hands and their voices. And across the room, I saw Jane Brunt. The next Sunday, the young adult group was playing volleyball on a sand court. Jane still insists that I knocked her down while lunging for a ball. I don't remember that, but I do remember asking her out to ice cream. And before long, we were traveling to visit her parents, Mike and Mary Jane Brunt, in Bloomington, Illinois, and meeting David Robbins, who would 5 years later become my internship supervisor at the Unitarian Universalist Church in Bloomington. The young adult group in Minneapolis became my primary support system. Over the course of a few years, 4 people left that group to attend seminary. But as essential as that social group was to my sanity and hope, I was equally drawn to Sunday worship led by Reverend Corin Arisian. Corin preached a religious humanism that I had been longing to hear. His focus was on the ideals of the American experiment: freedom, equality, democracy, religious pluralism. What did these things really mean, and what would it take to put them into practice? When Corin wasn't preaching, there was an incredible music program, a 30 or 40-piece in-house volunteer orchestra, which would play for the whole church hour on a Sunday morning, and no one would ever say a thing, and they called it worship, and I said, yes. Another Sunday, a couple of musicians played spoons on pots and pans. It wasn't a whole hour this time, but it was outrageous and outstanding and liberating. My son, Jonathan, was 3. I brought him to the religious education program because I saw that they were addressing the topic of death with kids of all ages through developmentally appropriate curricula. I thought that was really unusual and impressive. And I really liked the director of religious education, Beth Brownfield. I quickly got involved as a teacher, choir member, and a leader of the young adult group. And I'm not plugged in. At the time, I was working as a property manager. I worked at one property with 1,300 units of mostly low-income families, disabled and elderly individuals, Vietnamese and Ethiopian refugees. And then later I managed a upscale suburban property. I didn't know it at the time, but property management with these diverse communities was great preparation for ministry. Budgeting and bookkeeping, marketing, troubleshooting, and community building. Every summer we'd have giant barbecues, and for Thanksgiving we'd cook turkey for a couple of hundred people. After we were married, Jane and I made a deal. We were both certain that we were not doing the work that we would want to do for the rest of our lives. But neither of us could settle on an alternative. One day I told her that I wanted to be a minister. She was skeptical. After some serious negotiating, it came down to this. Yes, she would keep working as a nurse so I could go to seminary if it was in Chicago that I would go to seminary, because that was only a couple hours from her parents. And we would have a child ASAP so that this child could spend at least his first few years near his grandparents. And I would do my internship at Jane's home church, during which time she and I and this prospective child, who would come to be named Rick after Jane's little brother, and all of us would live in her parents' basement. Amazingly, all of this came to pass. Ordination in our tradition is conferred not by some abstract hierarchy, but specifically as a decision by a local congregation. It's not a top-down, but a bottom-up form of governance. It originated with the early Unitarian and Universalist movements, going back to the American colonies, and is based, I suppose, to some degree on Unitarian allergy to authority, so they wanted to do it themselves, and the Universalist insistence that we are all called to one and the same destiny. So there's no elevation of anybody or degradation of anybody. We all call one another in together as partners in salvation. Let's stop here for a moment to sing together number 317 in the gray hymnal, "We Are Not Our Own."
We are not our own.
local Methodist, Presbyterian, and Disciples of Christ clergy who I had come to know in Bloomington, dressed in their finery, processed into the sanctuary along with UU ministers from surrounding states. A letter of support was read from Father Mike, my high school coach and biology teacher. And Reverend Don Wheat from Chicago offered the charge to the minister, which is the official statement essentially of go get 'em and watch out. He said, preaching is like being married to a nymphomaniac. Just when you think you're finished, you have to start all over again. And though this was a celebration, it was also bittersweet. One person I would have invited was Bob Crumpler, who had supervised my hospital chaplaincy internship, also in Bloomington. But 1 week after completing Bob's incredibly intense and intimate program, he died of a heart attack. I still hear Bob's pithy observations about ministry sometimes in my head. In his mischievous Carolina drawl, he'd say, if you get close to the pain, you're gonna get splashed. He'd say, things are usually what they seem, and or exactly the opposite. He'd say, you can be angry, but that's not going to change reality. He'd say, when you're up to your eyeballs in alligators, is no time to reflect on the existential meaning of alligatorism, whatever that may have meant. In keeping with Crumpler's sense of humor and transparency, his wife held a rummage sale a few weeks later, laying everything out for everyone to see. I still have his socks. In fact, I am wearing them right now. No kidding. I often do on Sunday mornings. They put a bounce in my step. A few weeks later after the ordination, Jane and 3-year-old Rick and newborn Ben headed off to Berea, Ohio, where I would serve my first congregation, which had started up just a few years earlier in suburban Cleveland. We had about 70 adult members and 35 children. We met in a dingy middle school music room. There were benefits, however, to not having a building. We had incredible flexibility in worship, with no expectations that anything would be done the same way twice. It was a very nurturing environment with room to experiment and make mistakes. On the downside, our church office resided within our 900 square foot home, a bit like it does today. Church auctions were a highlight there in Berea, Ohio. One time, a church member donated a ride on his small airplane. I was thrilled when I learned that I'd submitted the top bid. We tooled around above Northeast Ohio for hours. I loved seeing things that I thought I knew from a new perspective. But there was a flu bug also flying around, and when we landed, everything seemed to come together at once. The noise, the fumes, the wobbles, and the changes of elevation. I knew that I couldn't drive home safely, but I hadn't written the next day's sermon yet. And now it was after dark. I made it to within a block of home before I had to pull over, crawl out of my car, and puke in my neighbor's yard. Fortunately, there were no streetlights. And as far as I remember, the sermon came out just fine. In fact, though I certainly haven't always been satisfied with the outcome of sermons and Sunday services, in 25 years, there's only been one major embarrassment. That was in my next settlement in Wausau, a small city in northern Wisconsin, where one Sunday I had made arrangements with a band called Unified Soul to present the entire service. I'd heard their songs and their inspired stories of peace and friendship across differences. And they had enough of a reputation that I knew we'd get people to come who would never otherwise attend a church service. So Sunday morning, the clock is ticking closer and closer to 10:30, and they haven't shown up, and they're not answering my calls. And I was too much in denial to even think about making a plan B until 10:31, when I finally realized that I would have to make something up on the spot. It wasn't horrible, but had to have been disappointing to those who were anticipating the magic of Unified Soul, who I learned later had gotten into a bar fight the night before and spent the morning in jail. But let's go back to the very beginning in Wausau, when I made my grand entrance shouting, "It's great to be here in the land of Jesus, because I love Jesus." Not a peep. They just stared at me. It was worse than being on Zoom. Either my delivery was off, and maybe I still can't quite get the right articulation of Jesus, Jesus, but they must not have been too used to humor in church. Fortunately, it was water communion, so once that familiar ritual got started, everyone began to lighten up. Until 2 days later, which was September 11, 2001. There were a lot of ups and downs in Wausau. Shortly before I arrived, they'd spent $350,000 on a massive new pipe organ, though many in the congregation thought it would be better to fix the roof over the pipe organ. Anyway, it was understood that this amazing instrument could simultaneously produce oboe and horn and piccolo and deep, deep bass. So it was forbidden to play anything else other than the organ on Sunday mornings. My eclectic orientation caused a bit of friction, to put it mildly. And at the same time, while everyone acknowledged that the religious education program was completely lifeless, it had been good enough for their children. So I instituted some changes, and within a few months, I learned that I had become known as the church wrecker. I genuinely understood the congregation's fear and their grief. The church was an amazing building on the National Register of Historic Places, and it was poorly maintained, energy inefficient, totally inaccessible fire trap. So we wrecked it and rebuilt the east wing and the courtyard. No, that's the old courtyard. Oops. Yeah, go to it anyway. No, stay with the old courtyard. Those icicles, I kid you not, could weigh 70 pounds and break off suddenly and without mercy. So we had to keep doing this until we finally decided to do this. Then, since we were on a roll, we did a little work on the sanctuary too. More important than the building, though, of course, were the relationships we built with one another and with the many local organizations that we sponsored with monthly collections and the groups that we began to team up with when Wisconsin started to go down the toilet, attacking unions and educators and expanding opportunities to carry guns, and through all the ins and outs of a state constitutional referendum on same-sex marriage. In response to all of this, we resisted relentlessly and peacefully. After 19 years in nursing, Jane finally got her chance to go to grad school and become a school counselor. About that same time, Jane's parents retired, and now they moved into our basement. But eventually our kids launched. And Rick already had a girlfriend in Seattle, so though there was still some quirkiness to be found in northern Wisconsin, still, we were looking to expand our horizons. I mean, we had to travel 2 hours to Madison to find an Indian restaurant. Fortunately, at least, we had a cookbook by Barty Kirchner. During his sermon at my ordination, my internship supervisor described worship services which I had led that year, that they were developed in the same way that some people make chili. Just go to the cupboard and throw everything into the pot. I've now gone on and done that today, and it seems we may have run out of room for dessert. Sometimes you need to move on before you can look back. So while I promise to speak again about the sorrows and joys that I've shared with you all here at BUF, I will conclude today with just a short piece that I once sent to the Wausau Daily Herald. They would publish a little column periodically called "My Job Rocks." So this is the column I sent. My job rocks because every day I have an opportunity to join people in their encounters with joys and sorrows, hopes and realities. We experience together life's intricacies and surprises, always learning from one another new ways to cope and hope and appreciate. My job rocks because as I encourage others to laugh at their foibles and to take seriously their commitments, I am reminded to treat myself with the same compassion and confront myself with the same challenges. I enjoy a tremendous benefit of the free church tradition, freedom of the pulpit. This means that I speak for myself. There is no doctrine to which I must adhere, and no reason to fear that anyone will take offense, for members of the congregation are not required to agree with me. Our covenant is simply that we will seriously consider one another's points of view, and that we will take responsibility for the consequences of our own decisions. So my job rocks because as a minister, I am not the minister, but one who shares ministry with hundreds of children and adults, volunteers and staff people, all working together to enrich one another's lives with care, honesty, and the example of living lives of integrity. Thank you for throwing it all into the pot with me. Your gifts, your sorrows, joys and memories, and aspirations. I am deeply, deeply grateful.
that we look upon tumble and fall. The mountains crumble to the sea.
I won't cry, I won't cry, no, I won't shed a tear, just as long as you stand by me. So darling, darling, stand by me, oh, stand by me, oh, stand by me, stand by me, stand by me.
Reverend Paul, we're standing by you. All of us here today, everyone out in Zoom land, we are here to stand by you. Everyone, put your hands together for Reverend Paul.
Darling, darling, stand by me, oh, stand by me, oh, stand by me, stand by me. So darling, darling, stand by me, oh, stand by me, oh, stand by me, stand by me, oh, stand by me, stand by me, oh, stand by me, stand by
How's this? Okay. I'm Carl Nyblade. I've been around here for a little while longer than Paul, and I'm delighted to participate today in the celebration of his 25 years of ministry. We started out longer ago than that, and we're known as a killer church for ministers. I must say we have had no problem with this ministry and any need to kill this minister. The biggest change that I've noticed in these orders of Zoom services is the offertory change. We don't collect it in person yet. We haven't figured out how to do that, and we'll probably just bypass that in the changes as we reopen. But we have need, as always, for financial support, and I encourage you to do the same that you have been doing successfully through the first year of this transformation. The offering is a sacrament of the free church. It is supported by the voluntary generosity of all who are with us. The offertory will now be given and taken, and grateful appreciation for the shared hopes and values.
I can't see visitors, and I don't like not being able to see visitors and welcome you with open arms, but I know you're there, and I thank you for coming. I hope that you will come again and learn more about us at BUF.org and in our midweek update that you can sign up for on BUF.org. But an even better way to get to know us while we're on Zoom is to join us for our after-service breakout groups. If you just stay on Zoom, our wonderful background Zoom hosts will divide everybody up at random, so we'll be in small groups that we can get to know each other a little bit better. And at noon today, please stay around. You might as well stay around for another 20 minutes because we have a very important conversation that we need to have together as a congregation about how we're going to reopen our building to more than 15 people, which we're very much looking forward to, but want to be able to do safely. And especially around the questions of vaccine, we have some very difficult decisions to make about how to make sure that we're optimally safe and welcoming. So please stay for that conversation. Also tomorrow night, please come on back to our first Monday of each month evening Taizé service. It starts at 7 o'clock, and that will, for the very first time, be live streamed from the sanctuary also. So that's really exciting. And the link to that is on BUF.org. You'll also find on BUF.org a couple of employment ads as we are hiring a full-time administrator and a part-time bookkeeper. So if you or anybody you know may be interested in a job like that, this is the place to be. Let's see. So with that, the benediction is words from T.S. Eliot. To make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time. Would you extinguish the chalice? Around for freedom.
Circle
That all worked.
Great success.
You can stop the recording probably.